Welcome to Reasoning, a new podcast from Strongest Layer, where we unpack the cybersecurity trends that actually matter. Not the vendor hype, not the marketing spin, but the actual structural shifts that change how attacks work and how defenses need to respond. So I'm Karen Latane. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at Strongest Layer, and I'm joined by our CEO, Alan Lafort. Now, since this is a new podcast and nobody knows who the heck we are, maybe you want to spend about 2 minutes just explaining who you are.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Karen. Hi, everyone. I'm Alan Lafort, CEO of Strongest Layer, and we are a third-generation email platform that is designed for a world where every email is as unique as DNA.
Very cool. Thank you. So we named this podcast Reasoning for a reason, like the double entendre there. In email security, the word has a specific meaning. Legacy systems pattern match. They recognize what they've seen before, but the attacks coming at organizations today don't look anything like we've seen before. The only way to catch them is to reason about what they're trying to accomplish. That's what this podcast is about. It's not about selling you anything. It's helping you understand the threat environment so you can make decisions for your organization. So, Alan, I'm going to kick it off and put you on the spot here. Anthropic just announced Project Glasswing and a model called Mythos that they said was too dangerous to release publicly. What was your first reaction when you saw that announcement?
Well, I thought it was a little bit, it's almost like when life imitates art, right? So for example, we've been using AI for a couple of years now, for lots of reasons, whether it's just writing better emails, better marketing copy. But I think what's kind of universal that everyone's found is AI tends to exaggerate, right? You'd be like, you'd be telling it like, hey, I just updated my data because maybe you're using it to track your dieting. And you'd be like, hey, today I just decided to eat a fruit. And then it'll respond with like, whoa, hold on, this changes everything. And it's like, dude, that's not worthy of that exaggeration. And I kind of felt a little bit that way with Mythos, because listen, for those of us who've been looking at this since day one, Mythos is just 0.3 on a curve. We had the big ChatGPT moment where the world was going to change forever, and it didn't. I mean, we adopted the new tools, and then we had a moment where all of a sudden everyone was like, wow, we've had a new possibility frontier because of the efficiency. It was this movement I call the DeepSeek moment, which happened last year, where all of a sudden the cost of reasoning dropped by 10x. And it was done with very little money to train. And everyone's like, what's going on? It's over. And we fast forward to now, and there's been lots of continuous innovation, the Sonnet models, all the stuff Claude has done around co-work, OpenClaw, and now Mythos drops. And now we're like, it's so powerful. We can't release it to the public.
Yeah.
But what I would argue is it is the most powerful thing this year. And next year, there's going to be another Mythos. And the year after that, there's going to be a not, because technology follows an S-curve. And we are just in that midway part of that S-curve. More big things are going to happen before it plateaus out. And so we should not be reacting to like, wow, this changes everything, because it changes everything this year. And then next year, something else will change everything. And so our view is like, this is just a new reality. And those who aren't designing for that new reality, for that constant step up in reasoning power or reduction in cost per token or ability to do complex tasks, if you're not building in that mental model and assuming you're going to get value from it, but also the attackers are going to get value, I think that's where you're making the big mistake. This is a curve. This is not a point.
I think that's bang on. I think the security industry tends to treat these kinds of AI announcements as isolated events, and you're absolutely right. And I know, you and Josh had worked on a white paper that kind of explains that whole curve idea, which I think is bang on. So you described something in that paper called the 12 to 14-month threshold cadence, right? And you just kind of explained how that works. Why does the pattern matter more than the actual individual model?
Yeah.
And I think that's something people are trying to grapple with, right?
Well, I think it has implications for how you design defenses, right? So for example, and it's a mental framework, I think. If you think of AIs in an adversarial context, then the AI itself, the model, is a weapon, right? And, is often the case, you don't just use weapons to attack, you use weapons to defend, right? So it stands to reason that if you're using a model to defend and a new one comes out that is 10 times more powerful and hackers can put it in play immediately because they don't have a compliance committee, because they don't have regulations to follow. They are pure economic actors. If it makes them more profit, they can switch literally in a weekend, right? And so then you can't switch just as fast because you've got even if you said, I'm going to take Mythos and deploy it, it's probably going to take you a few months to do the testing, to do a whole series of organizational things to get the approval to use it. So now you've got, for a short period of time, they've got a tank and you've got a gun, and you're trying to get approval to buy a tank, but it might take months, right?
Yeah.
So what do you do in the interim? That's the scenario we're talking about. Or you're a software company and you said, we're going to train our own models because the specificity of the data will lead to a better model.
Yeah.
And you go and spend, $20 million training your model, and it's based on some variant of some open source model. Maybe it's Quen, maybe it's, the Llama stuff from the Facebook guys. But you go and spend the money and now you have it, but it's built on tech from 18 to 24 months ago in terms of the reasoning engine and how it's set up, and, the LLM itself. Then it's your custom data that's based on the threats, probably from 12 months ago, right? And then you train it. And then this new thing comes up that's 10 times more powerful. It's generating threats you've never seen before, you didn't train for. And now you're basically, well, wait, we spent all this money to build this model. We got to use it. And so now you're locked into pushing your model when it can't come up against this much more powerful model that the attackers have. That asymmetry, that inflexibility that comes from deciding to train your own is something that we have to account for in the security industry, because very few companies will have the dollars and the access to create something that will compete with the foundational models that, let's face it, have budgets in the billions.
Yeah.
Right? So I think it's more of what is your strategy to deal with the asymmetry that can happen when you're locked in and you require a lot of friction to get something done, and they can operate in days and switch
Yeah.
out.
Yeah. So the defender lag really is more structural, right? Like, not
It is. It is.
operational.
Now, luckily, we don't think it's all doom and gloom. We think there's a fix,
Yeah.
which is, my model that said, think of AI as weapons. Well, weapons have munitions, they have bullets, right? You wouldn't call it a bullet on a tank, but it's a munition, right? But
Yeah.
the idea is that, the weapon has that component as well, which is independent of the weapon, right? So we think of data as the bullets, right? So the AI engine has a power, but it's only as good as the bullets it has, right? And
Right.
so data is that bullet. And then when you think about attackers that are trying to attack your organization, trying to infiltrate your organization, they need to know, well, what is the org chart? So what do they do? They go and figure it out by looking at LinkedIn or by looking at other methods that are publicly available, published by companies, corporate reports, all that. And they form a model of what they think is inside the org. They feed that into the AI, and they use that to construct attacks. So they're guessing what's happening on the inside, right? Guessing from sparse data on the outside. And they're kind of predicting, constructing a view of what's going on so that they can try and, subvert your organization, convince it that they are legitimate, executives trying to do a wire transfer, or they are a legitimate HR person trying to change your payroll. And the more details they have, the more real it looks. But here's the interesting bit. You don't have to guess on the inside trying to defend, because you have not estimates, not guesses, you have facts. The outside can say, well, based on LinkedIn, we think you are using this in your supply chain. But you know who really knows what's in your supply chain? Your ERP. Your systems of record know who you pay invoices to. That's a fact. If we can just in time load those facts in with the AI, it now has an advantage that it has ground truth versus someone's guesses and estimates. And that's incredibly powerful and can often be enough to offset the fact that they have a more powerful LLM, but it's constrained by the data it has, and you have perfect data. And that
Mm.
facts versus guesses is a very strong thing to enable for your defenses. So that's how we're thinking about, how do you shift the curve so that the power that they have versus your power of defense being shifted out, the data and the signals becomes the things that shift you, so you're more powerful even though they have a stronger model.
Okay, that's actually a good kind of segue into more about, like, when you think about compounding obsolescence in terms of a stack that a lot of organizations are sitting on today. An enterprise security team buys a detection product today, let's say, right? What are they actually getting really in terms of how current that technology is? And I think that kind of plays into what you were just talking about, which is, you've got this huge tech stack, you've invested all this money, and literally, a week to 2 weeks later, it could be obsolete, right? So how do you combat that? How do you
Yeah.
choose the right sets of solutions, knowing full well that the attackers are ahead of you almost all the time.
I think you hit on a key part, which is, architectures are designed to do things. And so the current solutions do what they do very well. If there's a known attack pattern out there, they will sense it, they will decode it, and they will push out appropriate protection. And it's a system that generally works really well when that's the dominant pattern, right? Someone decides to do a campaign against 100,000 emails. I mean, it's really, a template and a mildly sophisticated mail merge.
Hmm.
You'll see that template, you'll see that pattern, you'll create rules for it. You'll put, the URLs or the attachments will go onto a block list based on their IOCs. And so that'll generally work. Where it starts collapsing is when the AI does two things. It says, let me hyper personalize every email to basically, spear phishing, whaling, those would be the topics at scale. With that mass personalization, not all the rules will catch it. So you see a gradual decline. The second, more, I think, insidious one is what happens when you post, instead of pointing the eye to say, get better at going through the front door, and it says, get super creative and find 100 ways
100 ways.
to get in that are different. Just go
Yeah.
through the sewer gates, right? Go through the back window, go through the basement. Like if you were trying to break into a castle, you'd find all these different ways to get in, right?
Yeah.
And I think that, that's something, again, that when you don't know the attack vector, because it's being made up and it's unique, that's another area where the rules won't help you because it's never been seen before. And so the
Right.
more the attacks get unique through a combination of very extreme spear phishing, along with different evasion techniques, those two combined, hyper personalized outreach with hyper personalized kill chains, different ways to evade the current stacks. I think
Yeah.
that technology starts collapsing. And as those things become more successful, hackers are, bad actors are really hyper rational. They're in it
Hmm.
for a profit motive and they have no friction, right? They have no friction at all. They can change their techniques. So they will double down on what's working and abandon what's not. So over time, why would you go and do this templated stuff that's not working anymore? It's all getting blocked. Why would you do it? You would say, wait, this other technique's working for these guys and the defenses can't stop it. We're going to go there. Right. So I think given that rapid feedback loop, and I think another element is the techniques that are known to get through what I would call, your what used to be called, APT level techniques or nation state tech
Right.
required a lot of sophistication. I think that skill bar is collapsing. You don't
Yeah.
need to be an elite hacker type to do some of these things because they're known patterns and they can be automated and even improved upon, iterated upon
Hmm.
by, these AI tools that are out there. Some of them are, $20 a month for those tools and they're very powerful.
I know.
So I think the skill collapse, the economic collapse, those things that AI have enabled are really what's rendering the current tools, um, inefficient. That's
Inefficient
what's
or
happening today.
ineffective.
I suspect that the economic rationale will just make that worse. So
Yeah.
it used to be like, okay, well, maybe advanced attacks were 2%. But now imagine that baseline of 2% that everyone struggled to catch is now everything because AI
Hmm.
out the hell out of it. That's a big concern.
So let's take that whole concept, that whole idea, and now bring it to the board. So there was a data point that jumped out, which was an attacker with access to DeepSeek on December 26th had it in their tooling by December 27th. Meanwhile, defenders are looking at like 12 to 18-month cycles, right? So even if you go to the board and you explain this is the reality of the situation we're in today, how do you do that explanation? How do you say, don't worry, right? Don't worry. Even though the attackers, can turn things around a day, we're going to be able to defend that. How do you explain that? Like
Well,
that,
I think,
that's such a tough explanation.
well, I actually think it's not hard to explain generically because you have a lot of evidence being published in the media that this is happening, right? That things are getting more difficult, that more advanced stuff is getting through. It's being written about, it's starting to get written about because people are feeling it. And I think that like any other board conversation, it's really simple. The threat environment is increased by this. We have these gaps. The implications are the following. The cost to us are the following. What do we do about it? And it could be, and just like any risk management, you either, you accept the risk, you mitigate the risk, you transfer the risk, right? So I think I actually think CISOs are well set up for that conversation. I think what they're not well set up for is we have annual budget cycles. This
Yeah.
shifted on the third month after you locked everything in.
Yeah.
Do you
Totally
just sit
changes it.
flat-footed for 9 months, right?
Yeah.
Do you have an ability to go and get more to block some of these things? Do you have compensating controls that'll allow you to tread water while you make a decision? I think a lot of it has to do with it's not that the board conversation happens, it's how can you have a rapid response when security is both is just as much a culture of rapid response as it is about deep diligence. And
Yeah.
sometimes can be at odds, right? Like, and I would say the key question is, do you have an emergency mechanism where you can't wait quarters, but you can make decisions that are necessary because there's just too much going on, too much getting through? That would be my question. And I
Yeah.
think that's dependent on each org. But I would say if I was a skeptical board member, my first question is, okay, there's a generic problem, but prove to me that we have it. And that's often the hardest thing, right? Because how can I prove to you that stuff's getting through because my technology can't detect it? So either I have a large team that's been able to manually analyze it and say, look, here are all the false negatives, or you're a bit blind. And I think that gets into like, what are ways to get visibility? We're no different than any other vendor. We'll do POCs to show what we can see and what we don't see. And so I think that the simple answer is, get a baseline and
Yeah.
get an understanding if you're really affected by it, whether that's through a POC, through a third party, through a project that you spin up. But until you can answer, does this apply to us and how? It can be a little hard to get someone to say, well, fine, here's the money, right? So I think I would want to be well prepared with it's happening to us and here's the potential implications.
Yeah.
Here's how I would forecast what's going to happen to us if we don't do anything or if we don't change our defensive posture in a meaningful way.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think establishing that baseline is key and being able to go in and prove these threats are happening to us. Here's evidence to that. And here's the possible cost if it does end up being a breach because of it. But I think that is hard because even though there's been some of that in the past, it's a mind shift to it being more rapid, right? And being able to get in front of it beforehand, explain it to the board, and then open up the budget, like you said, to be able to have that money sooner than the budget cycle is probably aligned to right now. So that's a good answer. So we've worked on a lot of taxonomies, but you laid out a taxonomy of architecture bets, right? Some detection approaches reset to near zero effectiveness at each capability threshold, others survive and strengthen. How should a security leader evaluate which category their current tools kind of fall into?
I would focus less on what tool they have and more what are the attacks that they're struggling with, right? That
Mm,
the industry is
yeah,
stuck with. Because I think it should always be outcome back. Like the tool is just there to help people. And when it stops being helpful, that typically is when tools get replaced, right?
yeah,
But what are the outcomes? So, for example, one of the things so the reason we did a taxonomy on attack types wasn't to have the definitive end all be all, but it was just this realization that the language that we use to describe email attacks is like two words. And there's so much richness in the attack's intent, its techniques, its outcomes that I just felt wasn't represented by saying we stop phishing and we stop BEC. And when I
yeah,
would ask people, they'd ask me, well, do you stop BEC? And I would say yes. But when I would ask, well, what does BEC mean to you? I would get different answers. Some people were saying, hey, BEC, as defined in 2013, it was an email that had no payload, as in no URL, no attachment, but the words were meant to create pressure and impersonate, someone to maybe get a wire transfer done or to have an invoice paid, right? But it was this idea that it had no payload, that it had no links to click on. Well, that definition's already it's already outdated. That is not what we call BCs today. That's not what we're seeing. A
right.
DocuSign impersonation is a business email compromise. It has a benign link in it, which then goes through a chain of links to then get to probably a CAPTCHA and a credential harvesting page on the other side. It has potentially, in some cases, we've seen it combined with QR codes and, unique attachments in Word docs. So there's a lot of sophistication now in what a BEC is, and it has different purposes. So we decided we should map this out, A, to hold ourselves to a standard of completion on making sure we catch all these different variants out in the wild, but more importantly, to help people have a better language about what's going on in their organization than just a catch-all of phishing or BEC. And I think the credibility, the explode on the attacker side. For example, we just did this study where we looked at 5,000 alerts that got by
Mhm.
other technologies that were in front of us. And the point wasn't to say, oh, this technology is good or bad, this platform is good or bad. The point was to say, why are they magically all getting through now and why? And that led us to see something very scary. Out of 5,000 quarantined verified alerts, 1,400 of them had unique permutations of what we called evasion techniques. So we saw 22 different types of evasion techniques across 5 different categories, all designed to get through, right? So headlines, for example, would be, we talk a lot about people are like, well, we just got to enforce DMARC, which is an authentication mechanism so that spoof domains and other things don't get through. Well, almost 80% of those successful attacks were legitimate on DMARC because they were legitimate sites that were being used to redirect to the final malicious links at the end, designed to bypass email authentication. Or
Yeah.
CAPTCHAs themselves are designed to basically stop automated inspection of the pages for malware, for maliciousness, right? So now they've got techniques to avoid all the different sandboxes in place, social engineering to bring down people's guard, but augmented with a really deep understanding of organizational dynamics, right? And things about the individual that would make these deceptions seem incredibly real and lifelike. So when we saw all those different evasion techniques, that's when we were like, wow, we need different taxonomy based on intent because the techniques keep changing. And if you try and
Right.
based on the techniques, we'll have 100 entries by the end of the quarter, right? So we said the intents are stable, the techniques are not, but we need to give people a language to understand and communicate what's happening in their organization, which is what led us to this taxonomy, which we're getting tremendous feedback on, where people are like, finally, there's a decoding of all that's going on and an ordering of it that helps us understand where we've got gaps. So of
So,
those, go ahead.
yeah, last question, because it kind of ties into this quite well, and we have to wrap up because we're getting close. But if anybody listening on this call is an actual CISO and they read about the whole Mythos announcement and they're wondering what the heck am I going to do with this? What's the first question they should be asking their current vendors? And I think you hinted on that.
Yeah, I think I'd want to understand their architecture and how extensible it is so that, you know, if Mythos is there, but there'll be a next one, how does their architecture allow them to adapt as the threat environment adapts, right? That adaptability, that agility is everything. And there's always a desire for things to be, I think in engineering, to be like this is the way it works, this is the way that doesn't work, and having a little bit of that adaptability, that fuzziness to be able to bring in stronger models,
Yeah.
to be able to bring compensating data in to augment their model, like understanding how that architecture can evolve in the face of a superior threat, I think is something we all have to start doing more and more, because that curve of progress is not slowing. It's not going to bend for
No,
another
it's
5
going
to
to
8
keep
years.
going.
So that
Yeah.
agility and flexibility has to be the hallmark of architectures, because we're not in a period of stability. We're in a period of continuous rapid change, and our architectures need to reflect that.
All right, that's a wrap. Thanks everybody for joining and listening in, and we'll look forward to, our next episode.